Episode 61, Mother and Daughter. Everyone from the R&D department team was dazed upon hearing Jalen's words.
Jalen, what are you saying? Are you confused?
Is Dr. South here? Where is he? Can we meet him?
Who is Dr. South? Jayla, did you just say Miss Olsen is Dr. South?
You must be joking. Miss Olsen is so young.
Just as everyone thought Jalen was joking, Keira looked at him, her expression serious. She extended a hand to him.
Nice to meet you. I'm Dr. South.
Instantly, the entire team fell silent. Luca was the first to utter a sharp cry.
Keira, what did you say? Who are you?
The rest were stupefied. Keira looked over the group. During the past few days, she had been protected in an unprecedented way. Even though these people had initially misunderstood her, they quickly cleared the misunderstanding. What they did afterward moved her. She smiled slightly.
I want to thank you all for looking after me these past few days. If you have any technical issues in the future, feel free to message me.
With her identity revealed, she could no longer stay here for the desk job. She only came back with Jalen to say goodbye. She already had the medical materials, so she could leave now. While the team members were still in a state of shock, she quietly stepped back and walked out with Samuel. Jalen watched her leave. He unconsciously took a step forward, but then suddenly stopped. He began to regret something. His reaction to learning that she was Dr. South was so rude. Had he left a bad impression on her? As Jalen was thinking about this, he turned to find the rest of the team bug-eyed, each sporting an unspoken expression. It was only when Keira entered the elevator that the team came back to their senses.
Ah, Miss Olsen is actually Dr. South.
Oh my god, I was actually working with Dr. South.
She just said we could talk to her if we have any problems in the future. I've actually become friends with Dr. South.
Then, thinking of something, the team rushed to where Keira used to work, and all the stationery on her desk was swiftly taken.
Oh, these are the pens used by Dr. South.
This is a draft paper of Dr. South.
This paper cup Dr. South drank from?
Suddenly, the atmosphere became strange. Jalen watched them, and for once, he didn't reprimand them. He suddenly felt at ease. In comparison to them, he was very normal. In the administrative department's conference room. After Keira left, Lewis told the head of the administrative department,
Call the police.
These words scared the recently arrogant Poppy Hill, who had been released only 2 days ago. The head of the administrative department pondered for a moment before hesitantly speaking.
Mr. Horton, if we call the police, it will cause a big fuss and impact our company negatively. Actually, we never intended to call the police today.
Even if Keira was proven guilty, they would handle it internally within the Horton Group and not make it public knowledge. Lewis glanced at her indifferently. The head of the administrative department's heart jumped, and she immediately lowered her head.
Yes, sir.
Poppy shouted,
Mr. Horton, I just wanted to teach my daughter a lesson. What I stole was my own biological daughter's stuff, and that's not against the law, right? The victim didn't say anything, so why should the police be involved?
Lewis looked at her coldly. His penetrating gaze made Poppy feel as if she were in an ice cellar. Then she heard the man's deep voice.
What you stole is the core technology of Horton Group, and you're suspected of stealing company secrets, which is a crime. Even if she doesn't pursue the matter, the company cannot allow it.
Poppy froze and swallowed.
What secrets? Will I be sentenced?
Mr. Horton said in a deep voice.
According to Article 219 of the criminal law regarding the behavior of infringing trade secrets, if the circumstances are serious, the perpetrator shall be sentenced to fixed term imprisonment of not less than 3 years and not more than 10 years.
Poppy was stunned.
Is that serious?
The head of the administrative department gave Mr. Horton a strange look. Today's incident wasn't serious, and it didn't cause any loss to the company. Why was Mr. Horton trying to scare her? While thinking, Lewis spoke again.
Of course, if you were instructed or deceived, a lighter sentence might be imposed. So were you prompted by someone to steal the information?
As soon as these words were spoken, everyone's gaze shifted to Isla. Everyone could think, how would a 50-year-old woman who was detached from society know about a concept like renewable energy? It was clear that Isla lured and directed her. The administrative department head saw light. Any normal person in Poppy's situation would now point at Isla to get themselves off the hook. But just as she was about to speak up, she heard Poppy shout,
No! Isla knows nothing about this matter. I did everything, and it has nothing to do with her.
Isla was next to her, her eyes red. She looked at Poppy and said,
And Hill, even if you hate Keira and want revenge, you shouldn't implicate me.
She lowered her head to wipe non-existent tears from the corner of her eyes. Despite her grievous expression, a fierce light flashed in her eyes. She wasn't stupid. This simple act of entrapment was so easy to expose. Therefore, from the very start, all she gave Poppy were suggestive statements. After all, from Poppy's point of view, Isla knew nothing about her real mother. Isla just went to pick Poppy up from jail herself, and on the way she acted scared and elaborately told Poppy about Keira and Jake's bet. In the end, she remorsefully said,
And Hill, why am I even saying these things? I've just been worried lately. Dr. South hasn't been replying and it seems like Kira's solution is done. Jake wants to break our engagement. What should I do? Forget it. Everyone has their own fate.
Poppy, her biological mother, then took it upon herself to steal Keira's solution and even found a way to send it to Isla's computer. Isla wasn't involved in the process at all. Even if the police came, as long as Poppy didn't implicate her, she would be in the clear. As expected, the police arrived quickly, and after asking for details, they only took Poppy away. Isla didn't breathe a sigh of relief because she wasn't concerned about Poppy, but about Jake. Sure enough, Jake's expression darkened. Even though Isla wasn't taken away, everyone knew what was going on. The head of the administrative department gave Jake a strange look, and the suspicion in her eyes seemed to suggest that he and Isla were in on it together. He had no way to explain himself. Jake didn't even look at Isla and stepped out. Isla hurriedly followed him.
Jake, let me explain.
After the two left the meeting room, Lewis watched the direction they went. Why did Poppy protect Isla so much? He suddenly said to Tom,
I think Isla seems more like Poppy's daughter.
Episode 62, Discovery. At this moment, Tom had a dazed look on his face, and he was still in shock. He didn't know much about R&D, but he was aware of the significance of Dr. South to that team. He was looking at a post on the company's internal network with his mobile phone. Indeed, the situation had reversed. People had been berating Lewis for favoring a beautiful intern, but their sentiments had shifted.
Wow, Dr. South is actually the beautiful intern?
So, it was Mr. Horton who invited Dr. South to the company, not Vice President Jake?
Still talking about Vice President? Isn't he embarrassed? He got promoted to Vice President because he seemed to have brought Dr. South in as the technical support for the company, right?
Technical support, but Mr. Horton was already invited her to the company. When comparing to the two, suddenly Mr. Horton seems so mysterious and powerful.
I just asked Group 1 in R&D. Dr. South has already left. Why did Vice President Horton have to do this? If he hadn't slandered the beautiful intern, wouldn't Dr. South still be helping the company anonymously?
Tom was very satisfied, wishing he could drop down on his knees in front of Keira. Only when Lewis's voice rang did Tom hastily put down his phone, respectfully asking,
Boss, What you said made sense after all. Which mother would be so cruel to her own child? Throwing the child out of the completely ignoring the child when she's only in the middle school.
As soon as he finished speaking, Louis's face darkened, and his voice was as cold as ice.
Some mothers are like that.
Tom was dumbfounded. Only then did he realize he had said the wrong thing. Louis's mother was exactly like that. He hurriedly changed the topic.
Boss, you made an appointment to discuss the project with Mr. Allen.
I know.
Louis didn't continue the previous topic and started preparing to go to the top floor with Tom. At the elevator entrance, Isla was clinging to Jake's arm and pleading desperately.
Jake, I really don't know what's going on. Keira must have intentionally hidden her identity from me.
Jake pushed her away and scornfully said,
Isla, she's not that kind of person. I've known her for 4 years as a classmate. I guess Dr. South never promised to come to Horton Group as a technology consultant, did she?
Isla was stunned. Jake said angrily,
My proposal to you was a mistake.
Isla cried out in shock.
Jake!
Jake continued.
Tomorrow, I'll formally cancel our engagement.
Isla clenched her fists. Just then, the elevator doors opened and Frankie strode out with his secretary. Seeing him, Jake's face changed.
Mr. Allen?
The elegant and amiable Frankie paused. Jake smiled and said,
I'm Jake Horton. My uncle mentioned that our two families are going to work together.
Frankie slightly nodded. His attitude was polite but distant.
So you're young Mr. Horton. I'm here to meet with Mr. Louis Horton.
Upon hearing this, Jake awkwardly stepped aside.
Then please.
Suddenly, a surprised voice rang out.
You're Mr. Frankie?
Both men turned to see Isla looking shocked. She didn't expect that the older brother of the girl she met at the hospital would turn out to be Frankie. Frankie didn't quite remember her and asked politely,
And who might this be?
He gave off an approachable vibe, yet his words showed a sense of distance. Isla's eyes flickered as she laughed.
Mr. Allen, have you forgotten me? Oceanian First Hospital? Your sister? The phone call?
Frankie was taken aback.
Are you the good Samaritan who made the call?
Isla smiled slightly, holding onto Jake's arm as she implicitly admitted.
Mr. Allen, this is my fiancé.
Only then did Frankie seriously look at Jake.
Young Mr. Horton, what a coincidence.
His gaze grazed past Isla and suddenly suggested,
Mr. Horton and I have some business to discuss. Would young Mr. Horton like to join us?
Frankie, of course, knew about the situation of the Horton family, and so he had no intention of having any entanglement with the main branch of the Horton family. But if Jake is the fiancé of his sister's lifesaver, he couldn't refuse to help out. After all, the Allen family owed a life debt to their savior. Jake was stunned by the adulation he was receiving. Without Dr. South as his connection, his status was quite awkward in the research and development department. The Allen family is a renowned and powerful clan in the capital city, and Frankie specifically named him to participate in the collaboration of two groups. His status in the company would continue to rise. He glanced at Isla and patted her hand, hinting at his intentions.
Isla, I have to get back to business now. I'll take you to buy our engagement ring tomorrow.
Okay.
Isla sighed in relief. She must marry Jake. A while after Frankie left, he suddenly took out his mobile phone, found the contact of the savior of his sister, and sent her a message.
Miss Olsen, when are you free? Could we invite you and your fiancé for dinner?
When Keira's cell phone rang, she was engaged in a conversation downstairs in the lobby with the vice-chancellor and the dean of Oceanian University. She glanced at it and saw it was a message from a familiar number. Being sensitive to numbers, she quickly remembered that this was the number of Rebecca's brother. Keira was also curious about the events that followed that day, So she responded to the message.
How about this weekend?
After replying to the message, she realized something was wrong. When did she get a fiancé?
Dr. South, you are also a graduate of Oceanian University and should understand our educational philosophy. We sincerely invite you to come back to teach.
The vice-chancellor of Oceanian University was very sincere.
We hope you will consider it.
Keira looked up, skipping the pleasantries, and said bluntly,
I was originally planning to accept your invitation. After all, I was taught by Professor Miller. But now that Professor Miller is on leave, I heard that his postgraduate students are being treated unfairly.
The dean's face froze.
Dr. South, it's a misunderstanding. I didn't know you were Dr. South.
The vice-chancellor interrupted him.
Shut up. Even if she's an ordinary student, she shouldn't be expelled without a proper trial. Dr. South, we'll handle this seriously and hold someone responsible. As for Professor Miller, he has served for so many years and has taught many excellent talents for the school. I think he's very suitable for the position of Dean of the Institute of New Energy Science. What do you think?
Keira was very satisfied. She quickly reached an agreement with the vice-chancellor. Isla came downstairs to find them talking joyfully. She clenched her fists in anger. Seeing the respected vice-chancellor showed to Dr. South, a wave of jealousy welled up from within her. After they spoke for a while, the vice-chancellor and the dean departed. Samuel went to get the car, and Keira waited at the gate. Isla quickly walked over, unable to hide the acrid contempt on her face.
Keira, do you know why I hate you?
Keira didn't bother to respond. Still, Isla continued to say,
Anhill told me your computer password is my mom's birthday.
Keira slowly looked down. So, Poppy knew her so well that she could easily unlock the laptop. Isla took a step forward, her voice accusing and vicious.
Don't you have a mother of your own? Why did you use my mother's birthday as your password? Don't you think I don't know your little tricks with my mother? Covering someone else's mother is disgusting.
She emphasized word by word.
Don't you always dream of taking my place? Dream on! My mother will always be mine and it has nothing to do with you. Stop your wishful thinking.
Keira stood dumbfounded. An overwhelming feeling of panic suddenly filled her heart. Her deepest desire was exposed, and there was a moment when she felt utterly humiliated. Keira sat in Samuel's sports car. The cold wind messed up her hair, but it didn't disperse her thoughts. She had always been envious that Isla had such a gentle and loving mother. As a child, she dreamed countless times that she had become Isla, with Mrs. Olsen combing her hair and telling her stories while she nestled in Mrs. Olsen's arms, lingering for her gentleness. She carefully restrained and suppressed her yearning for Mrs. Olsen and never met her after leaving the Olsen family, but still set that password like a pervert. Watching the scenery on the roadside gradually recede, she gave a bitter smile, picked up her phone to change the password, and entered a new one, 1234. When the screen showed that the password change was successful, she felt an emptiness deep in her heart. She shouldn't have yearned for Mrs. Olsen's maternal love, even less deserved to disturb her life. Her eyes felt a bit sour. Keira gently raised her head to hide the tears in her eyes. Just then, Samuel's phone rang. He picked it up, and a voice came from the other side.
Samuel, I found out the secret about her uncle, Finley Hill, that the boss asked me to investigate.
Episode 63. Connection. At those words, Samuel cast a careful glance at Keira. From the moment his boss got in the car, she wore an unapproachable demeanor, which kept him on edge, despite being just her driver. He cleared his throat.
My boss is next to me. Go ahead.
The tone on the other end of the line became more respectful.
Boss, we found that Finley Hill has been gambling all these years, losing over $15,000 each month. A few days ago, he was set up and lost $30,000. The people at the casino were about to break his leg when he shouted something, as they let him go, guess what he shouted?
What?
He said his niece was Miss Olsen.
Keira was slightly taken aback, but she didn't take it much to heart. In the past, whenever Finley sought money from her, he would say things like,
You're Miss Olsen as well. Why don't you ask your dad for money? Boss, did he come to you for the money afterward?
Keira responded nonchalantly.
Isla must have given it to him.
She has. I checked his bank transactions. It was deposited 2 days ago. Plus, I found out that since 10 years ago, Isla has been transferring him $20,000 monthly. Over the years, Isla has given him almost $3 million. What kind of leverage does he have on her to extort so much money?
Keira coldly replied,
Isn't that what I asked you to investigate?
Boss, don't get angry. Let me finish.
The other person replied with a playful tone.
I've checked everyone surrounding Finley Hill. It turns out he has a pretty tight lip. He hasn't told anyone. But now I have an opportunity to pry open his mouth. All I need is a little cooperation from you, boss.
How can I help?
Yesterday, Finley Hill was cheated in the casino and lost over $500,000. He's desperate. After all, that's not a small amount. It'll probably take Isla some time to gather the amount. In the meantime, Finley Hill will have no choice but to turn to you, and that's when we can squeeze out the secret.
Keira frowned.
Were you behind this?
Just a minor scheme. Don't worry, boss. I remember you strictly forbidden partaking in any illegal activities, and I've been a law-abiding citizen who never touches drugs or gambling.
I see.
After hanging up the phone, Keira looked up. She needs to uncover the secret between Isla and Finley Hill to prevent any harm to Mrs. Olsen. Just then, her phone vibrated. It was a message from Mrs. Olsen to Dr. South.
Dr. South, are you busy right now? I've been thinking. I have a favor to ask of you.
Keira replied.
I'm free at the moment. What's the matter?
Mrs. Olsen immediately sent over a voice message.
Dr. South, here's the situation. Your design plans for Horton Group was stolen by a young girl named Keira. I would like you to convey to Horton Group that they should not hold her accountable for this.
Keira stared at the voice message for a while. She never expected Mrs. Olsen to contact her about this matter. Perhaps noticing that Keira didn't respond, Mrs. Olsen sent another voice message.
I know this puts you in a difficult position, but Keira is like a daughter to me. I've watched her grow up since she was little. She's not that kind of person. There must be something misunderstanding. Do you have some free time? Why don't we meet and talk about it?
A daughter. Keira's eyes welled up with tears again. She pressed her lips together and replied,
I'm on my way to your house.
Having sent the message, she told Samuel,
Drive me to the Orsons.
Olsen residence. After sending the message, Mrs. Olsen took a deep breath, feeling nervous.
Doctor is so sad. He will come here now.
Aunt South couldn't help but interject.
Mrs. Olsen, you are not fond of socializing, and you have seldom met with outsiders over the years. And yet, for that girl's sake, you're voluntarily arranging to meet Dr. South. You're being too meddlesome.
Mrs. Olsen's health was weak and she lacked the energy, so Aunt South had a soft spot for her.
Why do you have to be so concerned about that woman's daughter?
Mrs. Olsen lowered her head. Isla and Taylor weren't at home, so the two could have a heart-to-heart talk. Mrs. Olsen suddenly said,
Aunt South, honestly, even I don't know.
Aunt South was startled. Mrs. Olsen stared blankly ahead.
As you know, I've never been a selfless type. But strangely enough, from the moment I first saw her as a child, I found her adorable. There was this indescribable liking for her in my heart, and then uncontrollable desire to protect her. It's as if she were my own daughter.
Aunt South also remembered the young Keira. recalling the worn-out clothes she wore and how she was scolded and beaten by Poppy. Aunt South let out a sigh.
She was indeed pitiful. The poor girl got stuck with such an irresponsible mother.
However, she quickly changed the subject.
But ma'am, she's an outsider after all. Moreover, her mother was so wicked, and she has never come to visit you since she left. She's an ungrateful wretch.
Mrs. Olsen retorted.
There must be some misunderstanding. Remember, it was Keira who asked Mr. Horton to help get me a room in the hospital and then medical.
Aunt South let out a snort of disapproval.
If she doesn't even help with that, she really has a cold heart. Mrs. Olsen, don't let such small kindness sway you. You are also...
Before she could finish, Mrs. Olsen turned to look at her. Aunt South abruptly stopped.
What I mean is that you have surely experienced everything and should understand that all these earthly possessions are external wealth, and it is the companionship that matters most. Think about Dr. South. He has taken care of you meticulously. How much effort has he spent on you? He sends you gifts every year on your birthday and never skips any festival, just like a real son. If Dr. South doesn't want to let Keira off the hook, don't put him in a difficult position. In this case, Dr. South is the real victim.
Hearing this, Mrs. Olsen let out a quiet sigh.
I understand.
On one side was Keira, whom she had raised since childhood, and on the other was Dr. South, who had sacrificed so much for her. Mrs. Olsen also didn't want to make Dr. South sad. After some time, there was a noise from the entrance. Isla had returned home. Mrs. Olsen hurriedly stood up, walked over to her, and asked,
Isla, how did Horton Group handle the matter with Keira?
Upon seeing Mrs. Olsen's state, Isla's fists clenched.
You didn't ask her?
No, I was afraid that if I asked her directly, it would put pressure on her and make her upset.
Isla looked even more upset.
She's fine. Jake didn't hold her accountable.
Mrs. Olsen sighed in relief.
That's a relief. Isla, invite Jake over for dinner someday. I would like to thank him properly.
Isla's face tightened.
Okay.
Horton Group had issued an order not to disclose Dr. South's identity to the public. Within the company, only the beautiful intern from the R&D division was known as Dr. South, but her real name was not known. Just as Isla was pondering over it, the doorbell rang. After the nanny opened the door, Keira walked in. Mrs. Olsen was surprised and delighted when she saw her.
Keira, what brought you here?
Keira responded with a smile.
Didn't you invite me here?
Mrs. Olsen was perplexed. While she still looked puzzled, Keira opened Dr. South's WhatsApp chat and held it out for Mrs. Olsen to see. Episode 64, Lifesaver. Upon seeing the chat messages on the WhatsApp screen, Mrs. Olsen was surprised, and her eyes widened in astonishment. Aunt South didn't quite understand and hurriedly stepped forward to vocalize her concern.
Mrs. Olsen, isn't Dr. South supposed to come? Miss Keira has had some conflicts with Dr. South. It may not be suitable for them to meet, right?
The implication was that Keira should leave right away. Aunt South had devoted all her attention to Mrs. Olsen over the years. She saw that Mrs. Olsen missed her, but Keira never came home, which made Aunt South feel that Keira came across as cold-hearted and didn't deserve Mrs. Olsen's affection for her. As such, her tone was quite rude. But as soon as these words left her mouth, Mrs. Olsen grabbed her wrist.
Aunt South, Keira is Dr. South.
Aunt South was taken aback.
What?
She looked at Keira in surprise, her initial objections and dislikes pulverized in an instant. Isla glared angrily at Keira, believing the latter had come to show off. Fearing that her mother would delve into the matter too deeply, she turned to run upstairs. Mrs. Olsen noticed her actions, frowned slightly, then lightly tapped Keira's shoulder and complained,
My child, I've done so much for this family behind my back. Why are you hiding this from me?
Keira had a smile on her face, but her nose was tingling.
I'm sorry.
Why are you apologizing? You've always been smart, but I didn't expect you to achieve this much in your professional field,
said Mrs. Olsen as she took Keira's hand and led her toward the sofa.
Keira, tell me, what exactly happened with the theft of the plane incident? Was it Isla who framed you?
Keira helped her sit on the sofa and played down the situation.
It's just a misunderstanding.
Mrs. Olsen's health wasn't good, so she hadn't been managing the company and house affairs for years. She was upright and generous, teaching her children to always act with a clear conscience. If she knew that her own daughter had set someone up, she would definitely be heartbroken, which would eventually harm her body. Keira didn't want to disturb her and gently changed the subject.
I came here today because I want you to help me with something.
Mrs. Olsen immediately asked,
What is it?
Keira contemplated for a moment.
I have a friend who received some information. In the near future, the price of a stock is going to rise. She wanted me to invest in it. However, my company is about to go public and I don't have enough liquid assets.
Mrs. Olsen understood and cut her off.
How much do you need?
Having kept a close eye on the Olsen's assets, Keira was well aware of what the company and the family had at their disposal. She carefully cited a figure.
50 million.
Assessing Isla's situation, if she borrowed most of the Olsen family's money, Isla wouldn't be able to gather the 5 million for Finley Hill. Mrs. Olsen thought for a moment and said,
I have a total of 17,030,000 in a house and at a company. How about I lend you 17 million? Would that be enough?
Warmth flickered in Keira's heart.
Yes.
She hoped that the secret between Isla and Finley Hill would not affect Mrs. Olsen. In this way, out of respect for Mrs. Olsen, she might consider helping cover for Isla. But if Isla hurt Mrs. Olsen, Keira would act ruthlessly. After leaving the house, Samuel dropped her off at the hospital. At that moment, a luxury car parked in the parking lot. Louis got out of the Bentley, and his sleek black suit accentuated his slender figure, intensifying his inherently remarkable face's compelling allure. Tom saw Keira and hastily greeted her with a kicked-up level of respect.
Miss Olsen, you're back.
Louis instinctively looked up. Keira usually had such a defiant look, but she was deep in thought with a hint of melancholy on her face. Upon hearing Tom's voice, she turned to look at him, stalling her steps as if waiting for them. Louis stepped up instinctively to join her, and they walked side by side. He glanced at her unchanged expression, seemingly contemplating something, and initiated a casual conversation.
Miss Olsen, are you upset because of your mother?
Keira looked at him. Louis looked straight ahead, his deep voice gradually lowering as he said,
In truth, some familial bonds don't need to be forced. Some people aren't fit to be mothers. It's perfectly okay that you treat them as strangers.
Keira opened her mouth, wanting to say that she wasn't upset about this, but seeing the usually inarticulate man looking serious, she paused momentarily. There was a tree-lined pathway from the parking lot to the inpatient department. Sunshine filtered through the leaves, speckling his profile and adding a touch of loneliness to his handsome face. He had just said them. Remembering old Mrs. Horton's garrulousness, Keira realized that the old lady never mentioned Louis's mother. Did that mean they shared the same misfortune?
You're right.
Suddenly, Keira gave him a big smile. Her laughter was infectious, as if all her worries dissipated with her smile, which lifted Louis's mood as well. He awkwardly shifted his gaze and changed the subject.
Don't worry. I've already instructed the R&D department not to reveal your identity.
Keira's eyes lit up gently.
Thank you.
She wasn't ready to reveal her identity to avoid unnecessary disturbances from the industry. Louis replied indifferently.
You're welcome.
Keira suddenly remembered something.
You said earlier today that you had some news about Samuel to tell me? What is it?
Upon hearing this, Louis's expression tensed slightly. Tom, who was trailing the two, couldn't help but stop in his tracks, feeling embarrassed. Originally, he thought Samuel was Keira's boyfriend, so the boss wanted to warn her that Samuel was a womanizer. But to his surprise, Samuel was actually working for Keira. How could he convey this now? While Tom was thinking, he heard Louis casually say,
Well, I think Samuel is indeed a steady, hardworking, and reliable asset. He's a great employee.
Tom twitched at the corner of his mouth. On the other hand, Keira was confused. Why did that sound so familiar? As she was about to ask further, Louis's phone rang. He breathed a sigh of relief. He quickened his pace to put some distance between them and then answered the call. Whatever was said at the other end quickly darkened his face. Seeing this, Tom whispered,
It must be regarding the collaboration with the Allen family again. I don't know what got into Frankie Allen. He suddenly pulled Jake Horton into the project and insists on discussing the details of future cooperation with Jake.
Upon saying this, he couldn't help adding,
Originally, you made Jake lose face today, but now he's back on his feet and is even more arrogant than before. I have no idea how he got involved with the Allen family.
While talking, the three of them entered the inpatient department. Keira was about to go to the third floor when a familiar figure caught her eye. Rebecca Allen and a middle-aged couple were sitting in the lobby, seemingly waiting for someone. When they saw her, they stood upright, eyes gleaming with recognition, and Rebecca called out,
My lifesaver!
Episode 65. Visitation. Louis walked faster and had already gone up the stairs. Keira walked over to Rebecca. She was wearing a patient's uniform and sitting in a wheelchair. An older woman by her side quickly helped her sit down when she tried to stand up in excitement.
You should sit down.
Rebecca, after sitting, introduced the two people beside her to Keira.
Miss, these are my parents.
As soon as she finished, Rebecca's mother, Mrs. Allen, grabbed Keira's hand, eyes red with gratitude.
Good girl. Thank you for saving our Rebecca. I asked the nurse about the situation afterward. Without you, Rebecca won't have made it.
Keira was unsure how to react to such a show of sentiment. She simply said,
Oh, don't worry about it.
Seeing Keira's discomfort, Mr. Allen stepped in.
Miss Olsen, the Allen family is indebted to you. In the future, should you need anything, please do not hesitate to ask.
Keira said,
Mr. Allen, you're too kind. It was nothing more than a fortuitous act.
She turned to Rebecca.
Have you had your surgery?
Yes, I'll need to go through physical rehabilitation from now on. Miss, I'll be staying in a rebuilding. Would you come and visit me when you're free?
Sure.
Rebecca wasn't well enough to stay outside for long, so the two of them exchanged WhatsApp contacts before parting ways. As Mrs. Allen pushed Rebecca back to her ward, she commented,
Miss Olsen has such clear eyes. She seems to be a good person. Honey, are you listening? What are you thinking about?
Mr. Allen came back to his senses.
Miss Olsen looks familiar.
Familiar how?
Frankie's voice came from the ward, interrupting them. They didn't realize that Frankie and a stranger were sitting on the couch in the room. The stranger immediately stood up and greeted them when he saw them.
Hello, Mr. Allen, Mrs. Allen, Miss Allen.
Mr. Allen wasn't pleased. He felt that his son had disturbed Rebecca. Rebecca also didn't want to see outsiders. Just as everyone was feeling a bit resistant, Frankie spoke up.
This is Miss Olsen's fiancé, Mr. Jake Horton. He's come to visit Rebecca.
The three of them immediately changed their expressions after hearing this. Rebecca curiously looked at Jake. Mr. and Mrs. Allen exchanged a few words with him. After Jake left, Mr. and Mrs. Allen shared a glance and said in a low voice,
Miss Olsen seems so elegant and refined. It's a shame her fiancé is so... Well, we can't judge others' choices.
Elegant and refined?
Frankie thought of Isla, brow furrowing.
Mom, Dad, you guys can really misjudge someone. What Miss Olsen wants is far more than you think.
Mr. Allen was taken aback.
She hasn't made any requests.
Frankie scoffed.
She introduced her fiancé to me, clearly asking me to support him. If our cooperation with Horton Group is successful, we'll be supporting the main branch of the Horton family. Louis isn't easy to handle. She's been roping us into this dispute. Isn't that enough? At least she's sensible enough not to make any other requests.
Mr. Allen frowned.
I didn't expect Miss Olsen to be that kind of person.
Mrs. Allen also sighed.
She saved Rebecca. We should try to return this favor as much as we can. It's a pity, though. I thought Rebecca could have gained a close friend.
Upon hearing this, Frankie looked displeased at Rebecca.
In the future, try to avoid Miss Olsen and her fiancé. They're not good people. We're lucky we could return their favor with money this time.
Rebecca's expression changed.
Miss Olsen isn't that kind of person.
Frankie sighed.
Rebecca, haven't you learned your lesson? You can't judge a book by its cover.
Rebecca was adamantly silent. Miss Olsen was the person who gave her hope in the last moment of her life. She didn't believe that Miss Olsen was that kind of person. Although old Mrs. Horton had mentioned before that she didn't want other members of the Horton family to visit her, Jake still headed toward her ward after arriving at the hospital. He arrived at the door, and through the glass window, he saw Louis and Keira sitting on the couch, both working on their laptops. They weren't talking, but the harmonious scene still stung his eyes. He walked in, greeted old Mrs. Horton, and then left. As he was passing by Louis, he suddenly halted. In the past, the person he was most afraid of was his young uncle. However, Keira ignored Jake the whole time today, not even giving him a glance, which made Jake feel as if she was high above and untouchable. An unidentifiable rage welled up in his chest, giving him a bit more courage. He said,
Uncle, Mr. Allen values me greatly. He said to let me take charge of this project. But it seems my title as Vice President of the R&D department isn't enough. Maybe the position of Director of the project department should be given to me?
The moment he voiced this, the atmosphere in the entire ward suddenly turned strange. Keira didn't respond but only looked at Louis. By demanding power and status directly, was Jake using the backing of the Allen family to brazenly challenge Louis? It was difficult to say if Louis would compromise. Louis looked up, his dark eyes sweeping past Jake. Then he nonchalantly said,
You think the position of the director of the project department is enough?
Those words. Jake's heart leaped with joy. It seemed that the Allen family did put pressure on his uncle. But just as he was digesting this, Louis's low voice resonated again.
What about my position then?
Jake's breath hitched, and he felt an invisible pressure hit him head on. Of course he wanted the position of the person in charge of the family. But his uncle seemed to put it so lightly, yet his voice carried an undercurrent of rage, especially the icy depths of his black eyes. Jake felt a shiver down his spine. He felt out of his depth, and his heart was pounding. He swallowed and finally bowed his head.
I wouldn't dare.
Even though he didn't look up, he could still feel the gaze that seemed to have turned tangible. Jake felt a chill creep down his spine. After a long pause, he heard Louis's indifferent voice.
In the future, if there's nothing important, don't come to Grandma's place.
Jake let out a huge sigh of relief and left. Once he had left the ward, He was filled with regret and shame, feeling that he had lost face in front of Keira. Inside the ward, after seeing Jake leave in a huff, Tom snorted.
The project hasn't even started yet, and he wants a promotion. I've never seen someone so arrogant, however. Boss, wouldn't you blatant rejection upset things with the Allen family?
Lewis was silent. Tom quietly sighed. Seeing this, Keira cautiously asked,
Is there something I can help with?
Tom immediately replied,
The cooperation project with the Allens isn't about new energy, so you can't help. Besides, you don't even know anyone in the Allen family.
Keira didn't say anything more. The room remained silent throughout the night. The next morning, Tom brought news.
Turns out that Boss Allen's sister is hospitalized in this very hospital. Boss, you should visit her, not only because it's the right thing to do, but also to improve our relationship with the Allen family.
Lewis frowned.
It's inappropriate.
Tom thought for a moment.
Indeed, it's inappropriate as she's a lady.
He suddenly looked toward Keira.
Miss Olsen, you are Mr. Horton's wife in name. Perhaps you can accompany Mr. Horton for a visit?
Hearing this, Lewis paused while he was tying his tie, but didn't object. Seeing this, Keira nodded.
Okay.